The Franklin City Hall maintains its mayoral portrait gallery on the second-floor landing, where faces of every person who has led the city since its incorporation in 1799 hang in chronological order beneath small brass plaques listing their names and years of service, and where a painting installed in 1971 depicts Mayor Richard Allen Pemberton, who supposedly governed Franklin from 1963 to 1971, with a formal expression and crossed arms that seemed designed to convey authority without requiring the subject to open his mouth. The portrait shows a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and dark-rimmed glasses, wearing a conservative gray suit that could have come from any decade between 1940 and 1980, positioned against a neutral background that provides no context about Franklin itself or any specific location within the city. What makes the painting impossible is not its artistic quality or its subject's appearance, but rather the fact that nobody who lived in Franklin during Pemberton's 8 years as mayor can remember ever hearing him speak in public, ever attending a city council meeting where he presided, ever seeing him at community events that mayors traditionally attend, or even encountering him on the streets of the small Tennessee city he supposedly led through most of the turbulent 1960s. The absence of memory about a mayor who served 2 full terms would be peculiar enough, but the documentary evidence of Pemberton's administration creates an even stranger puzzle, because official city records clearly show his signature on hundreds of ordinances, proclamations, budget approvals, and administrative documents spanning those 8 years. His name appears in city council meeting minutes as presiding officer at regular sessions held twice monthly throughout his tenure, with notations indicating his participation in votes, his recognition of speakers, and his adherence to parliamentary procedure. Newspaper archives contain routine mentions of Mayor Pemberton in articles about municipal business, always referenced in third person, never quoted directly, described as present at various official functions, but somehow never photographed or interviewed. The administrative apparatus of Franklin city government during the 1960s clearly operated with Richard Allen Pemberton as its chief executive, yet the human experience of Franklin's residents during that same period contains no corresponding memory of a mayor who made himself visible or audible to the community he governed. The discovery of this impossible absence began in 2017 when the Williamson County Historical Society organized an oral history project to document memories of Franklin during the civil rights era, interviewing elderly residents who had lived through the social changes of the 1960s and asking them to describe local leadership during that transformative decade. The project organizers assumed these interviews would capture recollections of how Franklin's mayor and city council responded to desegregation, voting rights legislation, and the broader cultural shifts of the period. But instead they encountered a consistent pattern of confusion when residents were asked about Mayor Pemberton. People who could recall in vivid detail the other city council members from that era, who remembered local business owners and school administrators and church leaders, who described specific events and controversies and decisions made by municipal government, simply went blank when asked about the mayor himself, as if that particular position had remained vacant throughout the 8 years his name appeared on official documents. Subscribe now, because the evidence we're about to examine suggests this selective amnesia about Franklin's leadership connects to a broader pattern of how Southern cities managed their public image during the civil rights era, erasing certain truths from collective memory, while maintaining perfect documentation of a fictional version of their governance. Franklin sits 20 miles south of Nashville along Highway 31, a city that spent its first 150 years as a prosperous agricultural center before suburban expansion transformed it into one of Tennessee's fastest-growing communities, though during the 1960s it remained small enough that everyone supposedly knew everyone else, and civic leadership operated through personal relationships rather than bureaucratic distance. The downtown district preserves its antebellum architecture around the public square, where the Williamson County Courthouse dominates the skyline, where local businesses still operate in buildings that survived the Battle of Franklin in 1864, where historical markers describe Confederate and Union troop movements with more detail than they provide about anything that happened in the century following that bloody engagement. This is the kind of Southern town where history matters intensely but selectively, where certain narratives receive careful preservation, while others disappear into deliberate silence, where collective memory serves ideological purposes that don't always align with documentary truth. The 1960s represented a particularly fraught period for cities like Franklin, Caught between traditional social structures that had persisted since Reconstruction and federal pressure to dismantle segregation, between local preferences for gradual change and national demands for immediate compliance with new civil rights legislation. City governments throughout the South faced impossible choices during this decade, required to implement policies that many of their constituents opposed while maintaining enough stability to prevent the kind of violent resistance that drew national media attention and federal intervention. The mayors who navigated this period typically became controversial figures in their communities, remembered either as heroes who courageously supported integration or as villains who resisted inevitable progress. Their legacies debated and reinterpreted as subsequent generations reconsidered the meaning of that transformative decade. Yet Franklin's mayor from 1963 to 1971 somehow avoided generating any memories at all, positive or negative, as if his administration had been carefully designed to leave no impression beyond the official paperwork required to demonstrate that the city had functioning leadership. The Historical Society's Oral History Project revealed that residents could easily recall Franklin's previous mayor, Samuel Thornton Blackwell, who served from 1955 to 1963, and who remained a vivid presence in local memory 2 decades after his death. People described Blackwell's distinctive speaking style, his habit of walking through downtown every morning to chat with business owners, his reluctance to embrace racial integration, but his ultimate acceptance that federal law required compliance regardless of personal preference. They remembered specific city council meetings where Blackwell had made difficult decisions about desegregating public facilities, recalled his public statements, trying to urge calm and lawful behavior from residents who opposed integration, described his visible presence at community events, even after some former supporters turned against him. The same people who provided rich detail about Blackwell's mayoralty simply had nothing to say about his successor, despite the fact that Pemberton's 8 years in office extended well beyond Blackwell's 8-year tenure and covered a period of even greater social upheaval. The pattern extended beyond ordinary citizens to include people who should have had direct professional contact with the mayor during his administration, creating a void where institutional memory should have preserved at least functional recollections of working relationships. Former city council members who served alongside Pemberton during the 1960s couldn't describe his leadership style, his priorities, his personality, or even basic details like whether he arrived promptly to meetings or maintained formal relationships with other officials. Retired city employees who worked in municipal departments during Pemberton's tenure had no stories about interactions with the mayor, no memories of directives he issued or decisions he made that affected their work. Local journalists who covered Franklin city government during the 1960s, when asked about Mayor Pemberton, responded with the kind of baffled silence that suggested they were being asked about someone who hadn't existed, yet their own archived articles contained numerous references to his official actions and administrative decisions. The impossibility deepened when researchers examined the specific historical context of Pemberton's mayoralty and realized that his 8 years in office coincided almost exactly with the most contentious period of civil rights implementation in Tennessee cities, the years when mayors became lightning rods for community conflict, and when every decision about desegregation generated intense scrutiny from both local residents and federal authorities. Franklin desegregated its schools in 1965, opened its public facilities to African Americans in 1966, complied with fair housing requirements in 1968, and navigated the social tensions that followed Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in nearby Memphis without experiencing the riots that affected many other southern cities. These were precisely the kind of transformative events during which a mayor's leadership, competence, and moral character would be tested and remembered. Yet somehow Richard Allen Pemberton presided over all of it, without leaving any trace in the lived experience of Franklin's residents beyond his signature on the official documents implementing each change. The administrative records from Pemberton's mayoralty show a city government functioning with unusual efficiency and discipline, implementing federal requirements for desegregation promptly and thoroughly, while generating remarkably little public controversy or resistance compared to similar-sized Tennessee cities during the same period. City Council minutes from 1965 describe the desegregation of Franklin schools as proceeding smoothly and without incident under Mayor Pemberton's leadership, with careful planning and coordination between municipal authorities and school administrators ensuring compliance with federal mandates. A 1966 proclamation signed by Pemberton formally opened all city facilities to residents regardless of race, using language that emphasized legal obligation rather than moral argument, acknowledging the change without celebrating it, or condemning the segregated past it replaced. Budget documents show Franklin allocating resources to comply with civil rights requirements, without the kind of delays or resistance that characterized other communities, where mayors openly opposed integration or tacitly encouraged their constituents to obstruct federal directives. This administrative competence might explain why Pemberton's mayoralty proceeded without generating the kind of dramatic conflict that would have etched his presence into local memory, except that smooth implementation of desegregation in a southern city during the 1960s was extraordinarily rare and typically required mayors to expend enormous political capital, build coalitions among divided constituencies, publicly advocate for peaceful compliance even when personally opposed to integration, and visibly lead their communities through wrenching social change. The very success that the documentary record attributes to Pemberton's administration should have made him a memorable figure, either beloved by residents who appreciated his steady leadership, or resented by those who felt he betrayed traditional Southern values by cooperating so readily with federal authorities. The complete absence of either positive or negative memory about his mayoralty suggests something fundamentally different from typical civil rights era leadership, as if Franklin's government during those 8 crucial years operated according to a script written by someone other than the residents who supposedly elected and interacted with their mayor. The question of who actually elected Richard Allen Pemberton emerged as a central mystery when researchers examined Franklin's election records from 1963 and 1967, discovering that both mayoral contests showed Pemberton winning with comfortable margins against opponents whose names residents could still recall decades later. The 1963 election pitted Pemberton against Charles Edward Morrison, a local insurance agent who ran on a platform of maintaining Franklin's traditional social order and resisting federal interference in local affairs. Contemporary newspaper coverage described a contentious campaign focused on how Franklin should respond to anticipated civil rights legislation, with Morrison advocating resistance and delay, while Pemberton supposedly took a more pragmatic position, accepting that compliance would ultimately be required. Elderly residents interviewed by the Historical Society remembered Morrison clearly, describing his campaign rallies, his inflammatory rhetoric, his eventual defeat by a candidate they couldn't recall ever seeing or hearing during that same campaign season. The 1967 election record showed Pemberton defending his position against 2 challengers, winning re-election with 58% of the vote in what newspaper accounts described as a referendum on his administration's handling of desegregation. The historical record presents this as Franklin voters endorsing Pemberton's leadership during a difficult transition period, ratifying his approach to implementing civil rights requirements while maintaining community stability. Yet the residents who supposedly cast those votes have no memory of the incumbent mayor they were choosing to return to office, no recollection of a campaign where Pemberton defended his record or made promises about his second term, no sense of having made a conscious decision to support his continued leadership. The documentary evidence shows democratic processes functioning normally, while the experiential evidence suggests those processes somehow operated without the usual human elements of candidates making themselves known to voters, and voters forming opinions about the people they chose to govern them. What makes the election records particularly troubling is that voter turnout in both 1963 and 1967 appears normal for Franklin during that era, with roughly 40% of registered voters participating in each mayoral contest, ruling out the possibility that Pemberton won through extremely low turnout that might explain why so few people remembered the elections. Thousands of Franklin residents apparently cast ballots in races where Pemberton was a candidate, making decisions about whether to support him based on some evaluation of his qualifications and positions, yet none of those voters retained memories of what information they used to make those decisions or what impression Pemberton made during his campaigns. The collective amnesia extended to the losing candidates as well, with neither Morrison in 1963 nor Pemberton's 2 challengers in 1967 able to provide any recollection of their opponent when contacted by researchers decades later, as if they had run against an empty suit rather than an actual person. The search for photographic evidence of Mayor Pemberton led researchers to examine thousands of images in the Williamson County archives, Scanning through decades of documentation from city events, council meetings, public ceremonies, and community gatherings where mayors traditionally appear, and where photographic records normally preserve visual evidence of their presence. Franklin's collection includes extensive photography from the 1960s, showing city council members at work sessions, business leaders at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, school administrators at integration events, residents at public meetings about civil rights implementation. The photographs capture faces that elderly residents immediately recognized when shown the images, confirming the visual record's general reliability in preserving accurate documentation of who participated in Franklin's civic life during that turbulent decade. Yet across thousands of photographs spanning Pemberton's 8 years in office, researchers found only 3 images that supposedly showed the mayor, and all 3 presented significant problems that called their authenticity into question. The first photograph, dated November 1964 and labeled as showing Mayor Pemberton signing a municipal budget approval, depicted a man seated at a desk with his head bowed over documents, his face almost entirely hidden by the angle and by his hand holding a pen. The image was technically useless for identifying the subject, showing only the top of a head with silver hair and a portion of a gray suit sleeve. The second photograph from June 1968 purported to show Pemberton attending a dedication ceremony for a new city park, but the figure identified as the mayor stood in the back of a group of officials, turned away from the camera and partially obscured by other people, making facial identification impossible. The third image from March 1970 showed a city council meeting with someone seated in the position typically occupied by the presiding mayor, but the photograph was badly underexposed, and the figure's face appeared as an indistinct blur that could have been anyone of approximately the right age and general appearance. These 3 inadequate photographs represented the entire visual documentation of a mayor who served 8 years in a city that extensively photographed its civic activities, and whose previous and subsequent mayors appeared in dozens or hundreds of clear, well-composed images showing them engaged in typical mayoral duties. The contrast suggested deliberate avoidance rather than photographic accident, as if someone had carefully ensured that Pemberton never appeared in any image where his face could be clearly seen and identified. The few photographs that supposedly showed him seemed designed to technically satisfy the requirement that a mayor's presence be documented, while preventing anyone from later using those images to confirm what he actually looked like, or to match the photographic record against living memory of his appearance. The Oral History Project's failure to generate memories about Mayor Pemberton prompted the Historical Society to pursue genealogical research, hoping that family members might preserve personal recollections even if the broader community had forgotten him. Census records showed a Richard Allen Pemberton living in Franklin during the 1960s, with a wife and 2 children, residing at an address on 4th Avenue that corresponded to a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. Property records confirmed that Pemberton owned the house from 1961 through 1972, with tax assessments paid promptly each year. Utility bills, voter registration records, and other routine documentation confirmed continuous residence at that address throughout the period when he supposedly served as mayor. Yet attempts to locate Pemberton's wife or children, or any other family members who might have known him during that period, yielded no results that provided useful information about the man himself. The genealogical trail revealed that Pemberton's wife, listed in census records as Dorothy Mae Pemberton, died in a house fire in 1973 at a different address in Memphis, with her obituary making no mention of her years in Franklin or her late husband's service as mayor. The 2 children shown in 1960s census records, a son and daughter who would have been teenagers during Pemberton's mayoralty, could not be located through normal genealogical databases and appeared to have left no subsequent paper trail in Tennessee or anywhere else. Extended family research found distant Pemberton relatives in other states who acknowledged that someone named Richard Allen had lived in Tennessee during the 1960s, but who had no personal memories of him and no family stories about his time as mayor of Franklin. The genealogical record confirmed existence without providing the kind of rich family narrative that normally accompanies someone who held significant public office, as if Pemberton's relatives had also participated in the general erasure of his presence from accessible memory. The most disturbing discovery came when researchers examined the transition periods before and after Pemberton's mayoralty, looking for records of how he assumed office in 1963, and how he transferred power to his successor in 1971. Standard practice in municipal government includes inauguration ceremonies, transition meetings between outgoing and incoming administrations, public statements about priorities and plans, newspaper coverage of leadership changes. Franklin's records included extensive documentation of how Mayor Blackwell handed authority to his successor in January 1963, with photographs of both men at City Hall, newspaper articles quoting Pemberton's supposed acceptance speech and his stated goals for his administration, city council minutes recording the formal swearing-in ceremony. Yet none of the people who appeared in those photographs alongside Pemberton, none of the council members supposedly present for his inauguration, none of the journalists who wrote articles about the transition could recall the event when interviewed decades later. The same pattern appeared at the end of Pemberton's tenure, when he supposedly left office in January 1971 and was succeeded by Mayor Thomas Franklin Davis, whose administration residents remembered vividly because Davis became a controversial figure who openly resisted further civil rights advances and who clashed repeatedly with federal authorities over fair housing enforcement. The transition from Pemberton to Davis should have been particularly memorable, given how different their approaches appeared to be based on official records. Yet people who clearly recalled Davis's combative inauguration speech and his first contentious city council meetings had no recollection of Pemberton attending those events or participating in any formal transfer of authority. The documentary record showed normal transitions following established protocol, while the experiential record suggested a mysterious gap where mayoral presence should have existed, as if Franklin's government had simply continued operating under new letterhead without actual leadership changing hands. Historical Society researchers eventually located 3 former city employees who worked in clerical positions at Franklin City Hall during Pemberton's mayoralty, and who should have had routine daily interactions with the mayor as part of their job responsibilities. These individuals, interviewed separately to prevent their memories from influencing each other, all described a strange sense that the mayor's office remained occupied during those 8 years without them ever quite seeing or speaking with whoever occupied it. One woman who served as a records clerk from 1964 to 1969 explained that documents requiring the mayor's signature would be placed in a designated location outside his office door and would later be found signed and ready for filing, but she could not recall ever actually handing documents directly to Mayor Pemberton or receiving signed materials directly from him. Another former employee described a pattern where communication from the mayor's office came through written memos rather than verbal instructions, with directives appearing on official letterhead but never delivered in person or discussed in face-to-face meetings. The third former city employee, a man who worked in the municipal budget office during the entire span of Pemberton's administration, offered the most unsettling testimony about the phantom mayor. He described attending hundreds of city council meetings where the minutes recorded Mayor Pemberton as presiding, yet his own memory of those meetings contained no clear recollection of who actually sat in the mayor's chair or conducted the proceedings. When pressed to explain how this was possible, how he could have participated in meetings for 8 years without remembering the person who supposedly ran them, he became agitated and insisted that there must have been someone performing those duties, but he simply couldn't bring that person's face or voice into focus when trying to recall the meetings. The psychological discomfort this created was obvious, as if he was being forced to acknowledge a hole in his memory that shouldn't exist and that violated his fundamental understanding of how his own mind worked. This testimony suggested that Pemberton's absence from memory might not be simple forgetting, but rather something more active, a selective inability to form or retain memories about a specific individual, while other memories from the same time period remained intact. The pattern resembled certain neurological conditions where brain damage prevents the formation of new memories about particular categories of information while leaving other cognitive functions unimpaired, except that an entire city's population couldn't have experienced identical neurological damage that affected only memories of their mayor. The alternative explanation, that something about Pemberton himself or about his administration created conditions that prevented normal memory formation, suggested either psychological manipulation on an unprecedented scale or some quality of his presence that simply didn't register in the usual ways that human beings notice and remember other human beings. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a researcher examining Tennessee state government records from the 1960s discovered correspondence between the governor's office and various state agencies regarding a pilot program for managing civil rights implementation in small southern cities. The program, apparently funded through a combination of federal and state sources, though specific budget allocations remained unclear, involved placing specially trained administrators in local government positions where they could guide communities through desegregation in ways that minimized resistance and avoided the violent confrontations that had occurred in Birmingham, Selma, and other southern cities where integration met fierce opposition. The correspondents described these administrators as facilitators who would occupy formal leadership positions while implementing federal requirements according to carefully developed protocols designed to reduce community conflict and ensure compliance without generating the kind of dramatic resistance that attracted national media attention. One memo from August 1962, written by a Tennessee Assistant Attorney General to the governor's chief of staff, explicitly discussed the need to identify candidates for this facilitator program who could maintain appropriate professional distance from local populations while executing necessary administrative functions in ways that would minimize the emotional response typically generated by visible leadership during controversial transitions. The language suggested that the ideal facilitator would somehow be unmemorable, would perform essential duties without creating the kind of personal impression that would make them targets for community anger or resistance. Another memo from January 1963, just weeks before Pemberton supposedly took office in Franklin, mentioned that facilitators had been successfully placed in several small Tennessee municipalities, where they would begin implementing desegregation protocols while maintaining low public profiles that allow administrative action without political disruption. Franklin was not specifically named in any of the state government correspondence that researchers were able to access, but the timing of Pemberton's election and inauguration aligned precisely with the facilitator program's deployment schedule, as described in the memos. The program appeared designed to insert administrators into local governments during the crucial 1963-1971 period, when federal civil rights enforcement became unavoidable, using them to ensure compliance while protecting actual community residents from having to make or defend unpopular decisions about integration. If Pemberton was one of these facilitators, his mission would have been to implement desegregation in Franklin efficiently and thoroughly, while somehow remaining invisible enough that local residents didn't direct their anger or resistance at him personally, allowing the community to undergo transformation without the kind of traumatic confrontation between residents and leadership that characterized civil rights implementation in many other southern cities. This would explain both his administrative competence as documented in official records and his complete absence from living memory, because a facilitator operating according to the program's apparent guidelines would need to be effective without being present in the usual sense that mayors occupy their community's attention and consciousness. The facilitator would sign necessary documents, preside over required meetings, issue proper directives, all while maintaining what the state memos called appropriate professional distance that prevented formation of the personal relationships through which people normally remember their leaders. The strange gaps in photographic documentation, the inability of city employees to recall direct interactions, the complete void where memories of campaign appearances and public speeches should exist, all aligned with someone deliberately designed to lead without being seen or heard or remembered, a temporary insertion into Franklin's government who would guide the city through its most difficult transition and then disappear once that mission was accomplished. The program's existence raised profound questions about democratic governance and the consent of the governed, because if state and federal authorities determined that southern cities couldn't be trusted to implement civil rights legislation through normal political processes, the solution apparently involved installing unelected or pseudo-elected administrators who operated outside traditional relationships of accountability between leaders and constituents. Franklin's residents during the 1960s might have believed they were electing and being governed by someone they chose, while actually being managed by a state-appointed facilitator who maintained the appearance of local control while executing a predetermined program of federally mandated change. The erasure of Pemberton from memory might have been intentional on the part of program designers who understood that once desegregation was accomplished, it would be easier for communities to accept the changes if they couldn't clearly remember who had forced those changes upon them, if their anger and resentment had no specific human target to focus on. The most chilling aspect of this possibility was its implications for how many other southern cities might have undergone similar experiences, governed during the crucial civil rights years by facilitators designed to be forgotten once their work was complete. The Tennessee state government correspondence mentioned several small municipalities participating in the program, suggesting Franklin wasn't unique. If researchers examining other Tennessee cities from the same era found similar patterns of phantom mayors or city managers who left no trace in memory despite extensive documentation of their official actions, it would indicate a systematic program of imposed leadership operating across the region. The selective preservation of documentary records while ensuring experiential memory remained blank would represent an unprecedented manipulation of how communities understand their own history, creating official narratives about local decision-making and leadership that had no connection to what residents actually experienced during that tumultuous period. Franklin's city government showed no willingness to cooperate with efforts to investigate whether Mayor Pemberton had been a state-placed facilitator rather than a legitimately elected local leader, with current officials dismissing questions about the 1960s mayoral administration as irrelevant to contemporary governance, and suggesting that the absence of living memory about a mayor from 50 years earlier simply reflected normal forgetting rather than evidence of anything unusual. The Tennessee State Archives denied requests to access additional files related to the Civil Rights Facilitator program, citing privacy concerns and claiming that most relevant records had been destroyed in accordance with standard retention policies. Former state officials who might have been involved in program administration were either deceased or refused to discuss their work during the 1960s, maintaining what one researcher described as suspiciously coordinated silence about a period they should have been willing to discuss given how much time had passed and how fundamentally American society had changed regarding civil rights. The Historical Society's Oral History Project produced a final report in 2018 acknowledging that Mayor Richard Allen Pemberton's administration remained poorly documented in living memory despite extensive official records, but stopped short of endorsing the facilitator program hypothesis or making any definitive claims about why such a significant gap existed between documentary and experiential evidence. The report's cautious language reflected both academic standards requiring proof before making extraordinary claims and institutional pressure from city officials who didn't want Franklin's history to include suggestions that its government had been secretly controlled by state appointees during a crucial period. The compromise satisfied nobody, leaving researchers frustrated that they couldn't access the evidence needed to fully investigate the phantom mayor, while allowing Franklin's official historical narrative to continue treating Pemberton as a normal elected leader who simply happened to leave no trace in anyone's memory. Patricia Hendricks, the researcher who had uncovered the phantom residence in Sevierville's 1950s newspaper coverage, became interested in Franklin's phantom mayor after learning about the Historical Society's investigation, and suggested that both phenomena might represent different iterations of the same basic strategy that state and federal authorities developed for managing Appalachian and Southern communities. The phantom residence in 1950s Sevierville had created a fictional business class to help the town access development funding, while the phantom mayor in 1960s Franklin had implemented civil rights requirements without generating normal memories of local leadership during that transformation. Both cases involved the creation of documentary evidence that told a specific story about local governance, while ensuring that human memory couldn't contradict or complicate that official narrative, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of how historical records get constructed, and how communities can be shaped through selective preservation of certain truths and systematic erasure of others. What remains in Franklin is Richard Allen Pemberton's portrait hanging in City Hall, showing a face that none of the city's elderly residents recognize, despite the brass plaque identifying him as their mayor from 1963 to 1971, and a documentary record of smooth, efficient implementation of federal civil rights requirements during years when most similar southern cities experienced conflict and resistance, and official election results showing comfortable victories in democratic contests that nobody remembers participating in, and a void where memories of mayoral speeches and public appearances and personal interactions should exist, but somehow never formed or have been systematically erased. The city underwent fundamental transformation during Pemberton's 8 years in office, abandoning segregation and complying with new federal mandates while generating remarkably little of the trauma and conflict that characterized that process elsewhere. as if Franklin had been guided through that difficult transition by someone specifically designed to accomplish necessary changes, without leaving the kind of personal impression that would allow residents to blame or credit any individual for what happened to their community during the 1960s, and whether that erasure served the city well by allowing it to move forward without bitter divisions, or served it poorly by preventing honest reckoning with how it actually experienced civil rights implementation remains a question that can't be answered, because the truth exists only in documents nobody fully trusts, and in memories that somehow never formed about the most important years in Franklin's modern history. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next investigation into American cities, where the documented past contradicts every memory of the people who supposedly lived through it.